Hello, and welcome to the Moms Love Coaching Podcast, where we talk about self-care from the inside out for moms. I'm your host, Carrie McFarland, along with Angie Turgeon-Ledoux. We are certified life coaches and moms, and in this podcast, we'll go beyond the take a spa day advice and talk about real and sustainable ways that you can feel better, be happier, and stay out of overwhelm and burnout. You spend your life taking care of everyone else. In this podcast, each week, it's all about you taking care of you with no guilt and no apologies. We're so happy that you've decided to spend this time with us, so go ahead and grab your favorite cup of coffee, find a comfortable place, and get ready to spend the next 30 minutes focusing on the most important person in your life, you. All right, welcome everybody. This is the Moms Love Coaching Podcast, where we talk about self-care from the inside out for moms. We're back for another week. We have Angie here as always, and we also have a guest. Again, we had a guest before. We have another guest. Her name is Jen Jacobsen, and she is the ADHD over 40 life coach. And so she helps everybody over 40 with their ADHD diagnosis. And I think that, even though she doesn't necessarily focus just on moms, I know that there are a lot of moms out there that struggle with this. And so we thought it would be helpful to have Jen on here and talk about everything that she does. And so I'm going to let Jen introduce herself and tell us what she does. So Jen, welcome. Tell us what you do.
Hello. Tell us what I coach, as you said, adults over 40 with ADHD, many who also have neurodivergent children. So that makes it really fun and interesting.
Now, do people find their diagnosis or come across their own diagnosis a lot of the times because their kid was diagnosed with it, or is it vice versa?
Yes, that's exactly what happened with me. As we were going through the process of a diagnosis, I recognized different things from my past, and I kind of put the pieces together. And that is the story for so many parents.
So they see their kids struggling and they want answers, and then they find out that it's ADHD. And through that process, then they're like, hey, wait a minute. I have a lot of those same things too. Maybe I have ADHD.
Right. And they see the commonalities. They look, take a critical look back at their past and all the things they struggled with in childhood. At a time, if you're over 40, there was not a lot of understanding about neurodiversity in schools. It was not something that was really talked about very much. And it wasn't something that parents were educated enough to recognize. So there's a lot of people over 40 who fell through the cracks. And it just wasn't picked up.
And I would assume that kind of follows you throughout your life, because if you're in school and constantly getting feedback, either directly or indirectly, that you're not a good student and, you're a problem kid and you're this, you're that, then you kind of start to absorb that as your own identity. And then you bring that into your adulthood. So I can imagine that it's difficult.
Yeah, well, I think that is the experience that a lot of humans who identify as male have had, being called out for being hyperactive in class, not staying in their seat, not paying attention, talking too much, just basically not being present in the classroom in the way that they're expected to be.
Right.
And so a lot of boys were diagnosed for those reasons, because there were those outward signs that they had ADHD, right? They were hyperactive. It was really obvious that that's what was going on. However, a lot of women experience the inattentive presentation, because there are different presentations and different ways to experience ADHD. So a lot of women were, probably labeled as gifted and talented, like me. I was in my head a lot, but not showing really any outward signs that there was an issue.
So what are some of the inward signs? I had somebody explain to me once, because their daughter was diagnosed with ADHD, that the hyperactivity portion of it for a lot of girls is like in your brain. It's like your thinking is hyperactive rather than your actions.
That is exactly right. So it's like your brain is constantly on, constantly thinking, constantly ping-ponging, I would say, to different thoughts, different things. There's just a constant brain activity going on that, it's hard to control. And especially if you're undiagnosed, you don't know what's going on. A lot of people think that, this is just how everybody's brain works, right? And then when you realize you're kind of having to work harder or, come up with your own accommodations really to be able to keep up with everybody else and all the neurotypical people, then you start to place a lot of shame and blame on yourself. Like, why am I not able to do what this other person can do seemingly so easily?
That's interesting because it sounds a lot like anxiety, right? Your brain is constantly on and you're ping-ponging back and forth. So and I know that ADHD and anxiety are closely linked, but how do you kind of separate the two? Like, how do you know if it's just anxiety or just ADHD, or is it always both?
So when two things occur, together, two mental health conditions, there is a word for that, which is escaping me right now. I want to say coexisting, but it's comorbid. Yes. So ADHD is often comorbid with anxiety and depression. And so many, especially women who didn't get an ADHD diagnosis early on, are instead diagnosed with anxiety and depression. However, there are a set of criteria. They're kind of imperfect because they're basically built around diagnosing young boys with ADHD, but there are diagnostic criteria that set out the different ways that you would be expected to have struggled in your past with these executive functioning issues. So when we think about ADHD versus anxiety, yes, they are comorbid. They do show up together, right? They're like besties riding together a lot of the time. But the way to tease out whether it's really ADHD or just anxiety and depression is by looking at the actual executive functions, right? What are they? And in what ways have you had issues with those going all the way back to your childhood? So the executive functions, I can go through what those are, talk a little bit about what each of them are.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, explain executive functions. Yeah.
So basically, all right. So I think of executive functioning as like the control panel of your brain. So they help you to manage pretty much everything that you do. So down to like planning your day, to controlling your impulses, to everything, showing up places on time. Your brain's command center, which is basically the executive functions, control all of that. So under that umbrella are impulse control, right? So stopping you from doing the thing that pops into your head, like blurting out answers without raising your hand, getting up in the middle of the night and raiding the cookie jar. That is where your impulse control comes into play. Then you've got, your cognitive flexibility, your ability to, so let me say it this way. Like, say you're on a road trip and you hit a detour. Cognitive flexibility is going to allow you to adapt, think of a new route, and basically recalibrate and reroute without freaking out, right? So it's like the ability to go with the flow, flexible thinking. And then there's your working memory, which is basically like your brain's sticky note, keeps things in your mind just long enough so that you can follow through on a task. So if you've got working memory issues, those can show up like leaving your desk with the intention of going to the kitchen to make a sandwich. But once you get to the kitchen, you might completely forget why you're there and start doing something else, and then notice something else and end up focusing on that. So working memory is really crappy for people with ADHD. What other things? Like remembering a phone number long enough to actually dial the number. That's your working memory. It's really short term. Then there's task initiation. So even when you know you need to do a task and you even want to do it, it's the ability to initiate and get started on those tasks, even if you're not super excited about doing them. And organization, just keeping everything including your thoughts, your tasks, plans for the day and everything in order so that you can navigate smoothly. So all of those things together are your executive functions. Basically, having the ability to manage all of those things. And so there's a questionnaire that psychiatrists and doctors will go through, basically asking you, did you have trouble with these things in your childhood? Did you have a problem keeping up with certain things that, they will assess? And sometimes they'll even want your family members to weigh in and really give some color the background of how your childhood looked so they can really have support for a diagnosis. So it's all about how things appeared starting in your childhood and then going through the phases of your life.
So it makes sense, given everything that you just said, why, number one, diagnoses are missed or not even considered or misdiagnosed, because, at some point people struggle with one or two of those things, So, I mean, is it like, how many executive functions do people need to struggle with before you say this might be ADHD? Because like the going into the room and forgetting stuff, like I do that all the time now.
Right. Everybody does that.
Yeah.
And it's, we all have normal human brains and you're going to forget stuff. Your working memory is going to fail once in a while, right? So that's why we have these criteria. You have to be impaired with, there has to be clear evidence that you are having problems with these executive functions. And there has to be, let me think here, what's the number? I think you have to have at least 4 of the diagnostic criteria.
And I would assume over a certain amount of time that you would have.
Right. So the symptoms have to have been present before age 12.
Okay.
If they just started presenting in childhood, that's when we start looking at other neurodevelopmental or mental health issues that could be happening.
You mean in adulthood? You mean if they start presenting in adulthood? Or
right. If you just
puberty?
So if you just start, noticing, oh my gosh, my working memory is awful. And you're just noticing it for the first time as an adult, then it's probably not ADHD. It's something else. So that's a really important distinction to make.
What do you see, if you have seen this, in clients or people that or, just in your research about all of this? Like, what would be, say, the main thing that moms would struggle with ADHD, having kids, even kids with ADHD, but like, what do you see as like the biggest struggle for that?
The biggest struggle, I will just speak from my own experience and from my clients, because this tends to be the same across, everyone that I've talked to, including myself. And that is teaching the child and parenting the child how to be in the world in a way that is, non-judgmental and accepting, like radically accepting of who they are. That's the biggest challenge. Teaching them these things while you're also at the same time struggling to deal with them yourself, right? And maybe not even understanding that that's what's going on with you. An example is, say your toddler is having a problem with tantrums, right? They're screaming, they're having problems regulating their emotions. It's going beyond what you would expect normal toddler behavior to be, right? Your toddler's been acting out for like an hour or more, and you don't know what's happening. You're starting to lose your cool, or you've lost it a long time ago, right? So the ability to stay calm and model that behavior is a problem for us, right? Because if we can't regulate our emotions, then how can we model that behavior for our kids? That's a big deal.
So my kids have not been diagnosed with ADHD. When you talked about regulating emotions, that is something that we did struggle with both of my kids in different ways. That was a huge trigger for me. It was a huge trigger when they couldn't regulate their emotions. And so somebody with ADHD who maybe hasn't been diagnosed yet, but is sort of unconsciously pulling from all of the things that has happened to them over the years, and then trying to raise their own kids and not understand what's happening and why they're being triggered. I mean, I would assume that is something that would be really hard for moms to reconcile.
Yeah. And there's so much judgment there on so many
Mm.
levels. Like there's judgment from internal judgment, like you're judging your own ability to parent. Strangers, like in the grocery store, are judging you for the behavior of your child. Like, why can't your child walk along with you and behave? Why are they pulling things off the shelves? Why is this happening? And then the worst is when they try to step in and parent your child for you in the grocery store. Just know you're dealing with judgment on so many levels. And then there's the other parents judging you, right? There's the different parenting philosophies. Like, are you an attachment parent? Are you a formula feeder? Are you this? Are you that? It's not helpful. It's debilitating, really.
I was going to say, I used to say, no wonder parents are confused. You know,
Yeah.
Like when I was raising my children, there was a lot of controversy about spanking your child. And I'm like, no wonder you're confused. Do you do it? Do you don't do it? What's your, rather than, it's about your relationship with your kiddo and how you want it to be. And then the other thing that's coming up that I'm thinking about is, my grandmother, my father's mother, was one of those women that she always had a motor on. She always was busy. My father was a putterer. We called them a putterer. Like he had that excessive energy. It seemed excessive, but he was a putterer. And I'm thinking here going, well, was that like a form of like ADHD that we didn't, that's how we characterized it. But if you're a putterer and you get things done versus if you're a putterer and you never produce any results, I suppose it's a different kind of energy management tool. So.
Exactly. And then people have thoughts about you based on that, right?
Right.
Like labeling you like, oh, that person's ineffective or they're not efficient or they're, whatever the label is. We get labeled with so many things. And the worst thing that I am guilty of doing too is labeling my children. As much as I set out to not label them in any way and to just let them be who they were going to be, I still had a tendency to label them. So it was just difficult being a parent, a neurodiverse parent with undiagnosed ADHD to children. Also, when they were young with undiagnosed ADHD, it was basically like, what's going on? I don't know what's happening. Is everybody else's family this dysfunctional? Chaotic. That's a good word, right? Like, why does everybody else show up at story time all put together with their bag of snacks and they're sitting there, they're 15 minutes early, they're sitting there, their children don't get up. So I would leave situations like that and be like, why do we even try to do this? It's so stressful and so taxing that, it's easier to just stay home and not, go out and be around people because it was so stressful.
You can see how it can be very isolating, even when you do know, somebody has told you that these things could be ADHD. So finding a support group, very, very important.
Yes. And that was huge for me, having a support group. However, for me, I tended to be more like a chameleon who would sort of change myself to fit into whatever group or community I was trying to fit into. Right. So I didn't feel free at the time to show up as my real self. And that, that brought a whole other level of issues for me.
So as you're talking about this and talking about, judgment, and Angie mentioned isolation, and you're talking about, not being able to be your real self, like the theme through all of that is shame.
Absolutely. Comparison, judgment, shame. All of it. Yes.
So I would assume that prevents people from seeking things out, because instead of saying to themselves, I think something's wrong and I'm going to seek help, I would assume that most people would say, there's something wrong with me and I better not let anybody know.
Right. And it's like you can't reveal to anybody that you're struggling that much, because what are they going to think? Because you're comparing yourself to everyone. So the thing that really helped me was having a group of people who were also struggling in various ways. We all were aligned kind of around the attachment parenting principles. I was in this group of people who was very passionate about attachment parenting. I felt really drawn to that way of parenting because I had been adopted as a child and never felt super connected to my mom. So that was one thing that was important to me, is that I was going to do whatever I could to cultivate that connection with my kids. Within that community, there's also like so much judgment. Like if you decide to supplement your child with formula, you can never share that.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So, even within those supportive communities, there was still judgment. And
so it sounds like a lot of the work that people need to do when they realize that they have ADHD. First of all, it must be, I would assume, a relief, because you're like, now you kind of know what's going on and you can kind of deal with it. But at the same time, there must be a little element of like, people are going to judge me for having this, like ADHD, like when Angie was talking about what your dad was a putterer, right? That's a very different image than your dad had ADHD. Like it conjures up two different pictures of somebody.
Right.
So it's like that label that you were talking about it can be helpful because you're like, oh, now I can find my group of people. But at the same time, it could also be, it could be isolating and harmful if you let it be, because then you can say, well, there really is something wrong with me, right? I have ADHD. And sort of like you could go at it two different ways depending on your headspace about it.
Totally. And I think, once then you can start to manage. But if you don't know, you don't even know what you're managing. I think, one thing that's really important is, having that community and having people that get it is so huge.
For the moms listening and they're hearing this and they're thinking, you know what, maybe my kid does have ADHD, or maybe I have ADHD, or maybe my partner has ADHD, right? What is the best course of action for them to take to get better answers for what's going on?
For pursuing a diagnosis, it's a little bit different with kids than it is for adults. So for kids, there are all of these diagnostic tests that can be done that can really pinpoint what's going on better than just, asking a bunch of questions, like what was your childhood like, all of those things. So there's neurodevelopmental testing that can be done for kids, and that would be done through either a licensed psychiatrist or a psychiatric nurse practitioner. A lot of people don't realize that a nurse practitioner is an option, but I have found the psychiatric nurse practitioners to be really good resources. They're not booked up months in advance like psychiatrists are. Because that's what people think immediately. Oh, I need to see a psychiatrist. And then you go to find the psychiatrist to get the diagnosis and you realize, oh, well, I can't see them for 6 months. So what the heck do I do now in the meantime? So psychiatric nurse practitioners are really good resources. And if you can't find one, go to your family doctor and say, who do you have a list? Because a lot of times the pediatrician will have a list of resources to go to and care providers. So for kids, it's a little bit more involved to like take them through the testing process and really pinpoint what's going on. But for adults, for me, I went to my family doctor. And this is after having been in therapy and really talking in detail about it with her. My therapist, I didn't know at the time, happened to be like a specialist in childhood ADHD. And so she's the one that suggested to me, hey, I had already, gone through the diagnosis with my kids, like saw the parallels, but didn't really pursue it for myself because I was so in the thick of the parenting stuff. It's like, there's no time for me. There's no time to figure this out. But I was in therapy and she said, hey, have you considered an ADHD diagnosis? And I was like, kinda, but not really. I'm not sure. I'm an adult. I'm not a hyperactive little boy. Is that even a thing? Like it just didn't click for me that could even be a thing for me to get a diagnosis as an adult, right? I totally saw this as a childhood disorder. People find out in childhood, and it was basically, in my mind, the little boy not able to sit in his chair in class. That's what ADHD was to me. And so, sorry, what was your question? Moment. What was the question?
Oh, that's the best. Well, actually, I have another question now. So when you were diagnosed, what would you say was the biggest benefit from that?
That was going to be my question. So good question.
Oh, thank you.
There were so many benefits, but I think the biggest one was just the awareness and being able to start cultivating compassion for myself and understanding of how my brain works. That was the biggest thing, because that was what kind of set me on the path of really taking care of myself better, realizing what I need, and advocating for myself in a bunch of different areas.
So it empowered you.
Yeah, it was very empowering. There's a little sense of like regret, like, oh man, what if I'd known about this earlier? I could have done so many amazing things. Maybe I would have finished my degree when everybody else did. Maybe I would have a PhD by now. All of these things. So that was kind of a journey through like therapy, coaching, all of these things, realizing that I am on the exact path that I need to be on and that I was meant to be on. And I wouldn't have this life that I have now with these exact children and this husband and all of these things if I did not travel the path that I did. So I've come to terms with it. Like, I don't feel any regret anymore. It's just, this is what it is. We can work with it. We can build, a toolkit, set up guardrails around our routines and other things so that life is not quite so chaotic anymore.
Having known you too, Jen, you have such a accepting and humorous spirit that you can laugh. This is what this is, and that sense of humor is so important. I think that, and I'm wondering how that shows up with your kiddos when you notice if a kiddo is struggling, like, as what that dynamic is like, what benefit you have seen from that, from you knowing these things about yourself and about your children and about ADHD, and just how it helps you to be the parent you want to be.
I'm glad you brought that up, because humor is such a big part of it. It is such a big part of like not only accepting this diagnosis and everything that comes along with it, but just relating to other people, relating to my kids. Humor has been a huge part of that. It's become kind of a family like joke. Oh, mom has ADHD. You better call her. You better make sure that she's coming to pick you up at school, because she could forget. So it's kind of like, we're not shaming each other. It's like, oh yeah, I know about you. And I know how your brain works. It works just like mine. And my kids are so, like, they're the people that make me laugh the hardest more than anything. Like, the stuff they say, their sense of humor is so similar to mine that it's like we just crack each other up. So that's kind of a gift, right? I mean, it's taken a while to realize that, but it is a gift. And that's a whole other discussion about how I do not agree with the whole superpower negative or narrative. Like, ADHD is a superpower. It's amazing. No, I think ADHD is difficult, and if undiagnosed and untreated, it can ruin your life in various ways, which I'm not going to go into right now, but it is freaking hard. And I do not agree that there are any superpowers that come along with ADHD. So, like, say you were diagnosed with diabetes or heart disease. How ridiculous would it be for people to say, oh, awesome, that's your superpower? No, this is a chronic, usually lifelong neurodevelopmental disability that needs to be dealt with as such. It is not a freaking superpower. I'm sorry. There are gifts that can be unwrapped and found as you move through your journey. and you're willing and able to find them. But no, it's not a superpower.
I think you remind us, Jen, how important it is to be compassionate and know that in this world it takes all kinds of kinds, and that you never really know from looking at a person what is happening inside their brain. You never really know the challenges and what it took them to show up today in the way that they're showing up. And maybe you don't agree with how they're showing up, but you need it, but just to be compassionate, find that place inside you that can remember that everybody is human and we don't always see what people are struggling with. We usually don't see what people are struggling with.
Yeah. And that is such a good point, Angie. And I think, I like to think, and one of the experts, I can't remember if it was Dr. Russell Barkley or Dr. Hallowell, one of those brilliant men said, ADHD is an explanation, not an excuse. That is one of the best things for me to keep reminding myself. This is not an excuse. So I don't, use it to make my, lack of follow through okay. I use it as like a stick to push me forward.
Well, you recognize that it might be a little harder for you to do certain things than other people. I mean, that could be true for anybody, but you're recognizing that and you're relating it back to your ADHD, but you're saying, okay, well, I need to work a little harder at this particular thing because my tendency is to do this, and that's not going to serve me in the long run.
Right. And so, it has, for me, kind of gone back to really honing in on my values and my, beliefs about how I believe people, should be. And for me, it's one of my values to be, connected to people and to have compassion and respect for other people. And that means not consistently, abusing their kindness and showing up late just because I can. Sometimes I still do, but I will make every effort to not do that.
Going back to what you said about, working on not having regrets about being diagnosed later in life, because everything that you've done has brought you to this point.
Yeah.
To that point, you have created an entire coaching business based on people who are diagnosed with ADHD later in life, right? Hence the ADHD over 40 name of your business. So talk a little bit about that, a little bit about what you do with your clients, and maybe like what is the biggest transformation that you've seen?
So we start basically with just acceptance, like meeting ourselves where we are. And I help my clients to really focus in on the strengths that they have. Regardless of ADHD and all of the difficulties, let's figure out what you're strong in and what lights you up and what you really want to do in life, right? Because I think a lot of the time when you're struggling just to keep your head above water, you don't even know what you want. And so I help them to figure out what they do want. And sometimes that involves, making big changes. Sometimes that involves little things. It's just the process of getting to know yourself, really. Like, who am I? What do I want? And how can I, use this wonderful neurodiverse brain to get me there? And how can I accept all of these things and, figure out workarounds for all of these executive functioning challenges? So I think, gosh, it's hard to call out the biggest win or transformation that any of my clients has had, because I'm like so invested in each one of them and they're all amazing. It seems like for some reason, people who are on performance improvement programs at work gravitate toward me. And it could be because, so many people are suffering in shame, right? Because who wants to talk about the fact that you've been put on a performance plan at work, right? You don't want to tell anybody. So there are a lot of people looking for support for that. That's specifically why they come to me. Like, I'm failing at work. I don't know what to do. I feel like I'm going to get fired. And so I think one of the biggest wins that I've had is coaching somebody through that situation. It's not about learning to love your job. It's learning about is this even a good fit for me? Right? Do I want to get better at this? Am I in the right job, first of all? And if I am, what strategies and systems and supports can I put into place so that I can do this job really effectively and efficiently? So I kind of help them see that, and from a zoomed out view, right? Because they're like so in it, so in the emotions and all in the drama of their job. And a lot of times they've decided, I hate it. I hate these people. I can't do this anymore. I just want to quit. I help them see things from like a more neutral standpoint. Is this really what you want? Or, is this a good job for you? And we just need to make some tweaks and help the employer to understand what you're going through and get support from them. Is that what we need? Or do you need to just leave this behind and find a new job? So whatever that ends up being, I support them through that. So one of my clients was able to get her employer. She worked for a smallish company. They have less than 20 employees, and they were willing. Wow. They paid for her coaching because they valued her so much. She had been there like 15 or so years, I think. They have valued her so much that they paid for her coaching, which is amazing. And we were able to get to a place where she decided, yes, I do want to be in this job for now. I have hopes and dreams for the future. I'd like to be doing something different, but I want to stay here now. And let's come up with ways to sort of neutralize all the really emotionally charged things in my job so that I can just do it without so much drama in my brain about these things. I just, that's the biggest win for me, is when somebody figures out how to coach themselves through the day-to-day things and they don't need me anymore. So there's a balance there, though. I think people, even if they don't need the one-on-one coaching for the rest of their lives, right? I think they can learn a skill set, be able to implement things on their own. But I think that there is a certain level of like community and support that people with ADHD do need for life. And so that's something that's really important to me to provide on an ongoing basis for people. Like, so if you don't need one-on-one coaching anymore, you probably still want to be in a group of people who are dealing with the same issues and being able to bring it up to people who get it and are not going to judge you. And, it's basically your place to, soft place to land.
Well, so tell everybody how they can find you.
I am at www.ADHDover40, the word 40 spelled out, FORTY.com, ADHDover40.com.
And that's your website. And what about Instagram?
Instagram, I am at ADHD_over40.
The number 40 or the word 40?
It's the number 40.
I'll put that in the show notes, but just for people listening. So fantastic.
Thanks, Jen.
This was great. I think
I have so much more to say.
Super helpful.
I have a lot more to say, but
yeah, we'll bring you back.
This is not a 2-hour podcast.
No, no, it's not. But we could have part 2. We could have a part 2 at some point.
Yeah.
This has been eye-opening. I think that this will help a lot of moms, because I know that, moms are struggling with this. And even if they don't have a diagnosis, if they recognize some of the things that you were talking about that they could look into, or just feel like there are other people out there that are struggling with the same things, I think that's huge. So thank you very much for
You're welcome.
agreeing to come on.
Anytime.
This was great. All right, we're going to end it there. And I hope everybody has a wonderful week. And we will be back next week with self-care from the inside out for moms. See you later, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening today. If you enjoyed this episode, it would mean the world to us if you like, subscribe, and share. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review on iTunes or Spotify. This makes it easier for everyone to find us and helps us spread our message about self-care from the inside out. Have a wonderful week, and remember, making yourself the priority is the highest form of self-care.